Hi there, it's Scott Duffy from GetCloudSkills.com, and I'm so thrilled that you're here today to talk about Azure Blob Storage. Now, Azure Blob Storage is a way of storing files within Microsoft Azure in a container type metaphor. So this video I'm about to show you is actually a sample from my AZ-104, Microsoft Azure Administrator exam course that I just recorded this video just this week. So it's fresh content using the latest user interface. In fact, the Azure Portal interface for storage has changed a little bit this year, and so any videos that you're watching from more than a couple of months ago might be a little bit out of date, but this is the latest, I assure you. Thanks for tuning in. Again, please like and subscribe, and if you like the course, there's a link to the course in the description. Let's talk about Azure Blob Storage. So in this section of the course, we're going to be talking about storage accounts. Now, within Microsoft Azure and cloud computing in general, storage accounts are a pretty fundamental piece of technology. There's a lot of services in Azure that require you to have a storage account, or services that are basically abstractions built on top of storage account, such as a recovery services vault. And so a storage account is basically a place where you can store files in Azure. Now, by default, a storage account has what is called a container metaphor. That is a blob storage account, where you can basically place files into a container and you can organize your files inside that container. Now, there's also a files metaphor with Azure Files, where you have more of a traditional Windows file structure where things have folders and subfolders, and you can share those and other people can mount those or connect to those. The other type of storage within Azure is what's called managed storage, which is basically the backend for virtual machines. So when you create a virtual machine, it requires a storage account, in this case a managed storage account, and it's going to create your C drive and your D drive, your virtual machine, a virtual hard disk onto an existing storage account location. And those are basically the two types of storage within Azure. So in this video, we're going to go ahead and create our very first storage account of this course. Now, in creating it, we're going to see how simple it can be to create, but there are a lot of options along the way, and we're going to talk about that. So here we are in the Azure portal, and as with anything in Azure, there are several different ways to access the wizard to create storage accounts. Now we can see the storage account is actually listed as a recent service here for me, and I can actually create a storage account right from that recent list. Right next to it is the Create a Resource button on the home screen. If you don't have the home screen, but you have the menu, you can create the Create a Resource button on the menu, or we can go into the storage resources if you have them on your menu and create a resource from there. For simplicity, I'm just going to click the Create a Resource button. Storage account is a popular service, and you can see it right on the home page under Popular. Of course, you can go under Storage as well and find it under there. I'm just going to click Create right from here. Now, the wizard has recently changed, and so they've reorganized some of the tabs and changed some of the fields. As with almost any resource, you have to choose the subscription that it belongs to and put it into a resource group. So I choose my subscription, and I'm going to create a resource group called AZ Storage to place this account. I do have to give it a name, and you can see that AZ Storage is already taken. I may be using it somewhere else, or a student may have picked it up from me. So I'm going to put the word new at the end. We do have to choose which region of the world that we can create this account. Now, there are 60 plus regions, but we don't have access to all of them. And what Microsoft has done lately is they've listed things under recommended, and you actually have to dig under other to see some other regions. So they're going to recommend to me, I'm going to put this in Canada Central. You can put this in whatever region that you wish. My understanding is that all regions of the world support storage accounts. You might find different features turned on or off depending on the region. Now, we're going to get into the types of storage in a second. For now, we're going to stick to the standard performance. Now, if we want to get this onto an SSD, which has much higher performance but does have a cost implication, we can choose the premium service. Standard service is recommended for most scenarios. Now you'll see here by default it's telling me to pick the GeoRedundant Storage. This is a redundancy option. Now redundancy means that Azure is going to store your files not only in the region, in this case Canada Central, but it's also going to store a copy of your files in a secondary region. And with this checkbox, I can see that it's even offering me a read access URL, and so that I can access those files as a read basis from that secondary region. There is a cost to redundancy. Locally redundant storage is going to basically store 3 copies of my files in the Canada Central region, so that if one file was to accidentally become corrupted or the hard drive was just to outright fail, they still have 2 additional copies of my files. Zone redundant storage is similar, but the thing with zones in Azure is these are separate data centers, separate buildings running on their own power, water, and internet supplies, etc. The GeoRedundant storage options we've seen, this being second region of the world, so that's 6 copies of your files, and the zone redundant storage actually combines it with the zone redundant option so that it's stored in different data centers. And again, there are cost implications of each of these. So I'm going to leave that as locally redundant storage for now. So that's it for this video. In the next video, we're going to move on to the advanced tab of the creating a storage. All right, so we're going to go ahead to the advanced tab. And we can see here that the settings in the advanced tab are around security, data lake storage, and the concept of blob storage, Azure files, and tables and queues. So let's deal with the first section, which is security. Now the first security option is to enable secure transfer. What this means is that you have to be using a secure connection in order to access your storage account when this is enabled, and that is HTTPS for the REST APIs. You can disable this, but by default it's enabled, and you should probably leave it enabled unless you have a really good reason to want to do insecure storage. The second option is what's called infrastructure encryption. Now this is a relatively new option, but it allows you to encrypt your storage account data at rest. Now storage accounts are already encrypted. They're encrypted by Azure, and you can also take over the security key, which we'll talk about in a second. But you have this option of double encrypting your data. So it's encrypted before it's stored, and then the storage account itself encrypts it. That is disabled by default. Public blob access allows you to identify files in your storage account that can be accessed from the internet without an authentication key. Now this is turned on. It's a bit of an insecure option, but you do have to specifically enable containers and files in order to access those files. So if security is a major concern and you don't even want to give people the option to grant public access, which again must explicitly be done, then you can disable this. Storage key access is the default way of accessing a storage account, and this is also a relatively new option where you can actually just not even allow storage key access. Without this, then you're going to have to be using role-based authentication, which is Azure Active Directory authentication, to access your storage account. So this is basically an interesting option. If you want to really make sure that all authentication goes through Azure Active Directory, you would turn this on. TLS is the HTTPS SSL standard, and the most recent version of TLS is the most secure. There has been some vulnerabilities found, I believe, in some older versions, and so that's why this minimum TLS version exists. Don't touch that, I guess. Now, Data Lake Gen 2 is basically data lake storage is a storage for extremely large amounts of data. It's used in big data. When you're using a data warehouse or data analytics solution, you're basically going to be enabling a big data solution if you were to enable this. It does use a separate file storage system. So there is a big data storage solution that is different than the container option. It is a hierarchical namespace, which is closer to Azure Files than a container solution. unless you're working with big data, you leave this disabled. This probably should be a separate product within the marketplace. You should probably search for data lake if you're looking for a data lake. But if you ever needed to create one, this is where that is. Now, scrolling down. Now, within a storage account, we haven't talked about it yet, but you have blob storage, which is the main type of storage. You have table storage, you have queue storage, and you have Azure files. So there are 4 types of files that you can store in a storage account. So this option has to do only with blob storage. So the first option has to do with something called NFS, Network File Share, which is a protocol for sharing files, mounting files. So if you have a computer and you want to say, I want a T drive or an S drive, you're going to use something like NFS as one of the protocols for mounting that drive. There is a version 3 option for that, but you do have to sign up in order to get access to that per subscription. So I'm not currently signed up for the NFS v3, and so I don't have that enabled. We're going to get talking more about access tiers. It is an important topic on this exam, but understanding that we can set the default access tier. So it can either be hot or cool. You cannot set archive as a default access tier. So hot or cool can be default, and then you can use lifecycle management to move files from hot to cool to archive over a specific time period, or you can manually set files as one of these access tiers. The pricing of the per gigabyte storage and the per file access does get different for each of these access tiers. We'll talk more about that. We have a video for that. Azure Files. This allows you to enable large file shares up to 1 terabyte. So it is not something that is turned on by default, but if you do want to do file shares of 100 terabytes, this is where you turn that on. And tables and queues, like I said, it's one of the types of things that you can store in a storage account. Azure Storage Tables, it's a columnar type storage, rows and columns. Queues is going to be first in, first out, a type of relationship. Messaging. And if you want to control the security keys for that, this is where you turn that on. As you can see, the Advanced tab is hiding a lot of very specific things. You might find on the exam, it might ask you a question, how do you turn on secure transfer? And you'll need to know this Advanced tab is where it is. All right, let's move on to the Networking tab. Now, networking is another area in Azure that over the last couple of years has been enhanced. A lot of the public services that were previously only available through public endpoints now have the option for not only private endpoints, but endpoints that are connected to your virtual networks. And so we'll see here on the networking tab that we have the option of either having a publicly available resource, which is only available on specific virtual networks, or a private endpoint. And so public endpoint's the default. Now that does not mean that your storage is publicly available. We saw on the previous tab that we could disable storage account key access, and so you must have a storage account key or be authorized in Azure authentication in order to have access to this storage account. And so even though there's an endpoint, you still need authentication. So this is not an unsafe method, but there are some companies who do not want even their endpoints exposed because of the potential for someone to figure out a way around a supposedly secure system. And so you can attach your storage account to a specific virtual network. Now you'll see I said private and public endpoint selected networks, but I don't have a virtual network that's waiting to go. So I'm going to have the option of creating one if I want. Now a private endpoint is, again, relatively new option within Azure, and basically I can create an endpoint in a specific subscription, resource group, region, etc. that will only be accessible at that level. And so there's a whole thing in order to create a private endpoint. It does have to be deployed to a VNet, and then you can use regular routing and firewalls and other services from there. You can see there's a option for DNS services. I'm going to leave the public endpoint enabled. Like I said, it is secure. It's just you have to protect your keys. The second option on the networking tab is the network routing. Now, the two options here are Microsoft Network Routing and Internet Routing. Now, basically, this is going to be how the traffic travels between the storage account and the consumer of the storage account that's on the internet. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you have a storage account, as we do here, in Canada East. And you have a client in Japan who is trying to access the storage account. It could be your Japan office, it could be your end client, or whoever. So if you're using Microsoft Network Routing, those files from the storage account are going to travel across the Microsoft internal global network as long as possible. And you can sort of imagine the files will exit Microsoft Network and onto the public network as close to the customer, the client, as possible. So this is essentially using the Microsoft Network as long as you can. The internet routing option basically has the file pop onto the internet as close to the storage account, travel over the public internet from, Canada in this case, to Japan. And so which of the following networks are you going to want your files to travel? I should mention that there is a bandwidth option, when you're using the Microsoft Network, traveling from region to region. There are some subtle charges for that, very small charges, but nonetheless they add up. Obviously, if you're traveling over the public internet, then you're not paying extra for files to travel a long distance over the public internet. But your files are traveling over, from route to route, from router to router to router, however that travels over the internet. So there are some pricing differences. The internet routing is called cost optimized, and privacy differences, which Microsoft Network could argue to be more private. So that is the networking options you have on the networking tab. Next, we're going to hop over to the fourth tab called Data Protection, which is basically some services around both recovery for your files and tracking. Now, some of these things are relatively recent additions to storage accounts. For instance, being able to do point-in-time restoration for the container. So let's say you want to restore the container to the way that it was last Saturday at 2 p.m. Well, you can choose that date and time and tell Azure, and it will basically be able to restore your storage account to an earlier state. This does need to be enabled. The soft delete option is basically allowing you to recover files that have been deleted. So over a 7-day period, if you delete a file within 7 days, you can restore it. The other option is soft delete on the container level. So if you just completely trash a container, you can restore those. And finally, the same option for file shares. Now, I'm going to disable these, basically because it does make it, it does take time then for you to delete files as opposed to being able to delete them immediately. The tracking options, again, relatively new, enabling versioning. So if you have files that are being updated, you're on version 2, version 3, version 4, and then you can go back and see, oh, this was version 3, this is version 2. You can pull version 2 and do a comparison. So versioning is a very handy feature depending on your use case. And the change feed basically allows the blob account to track changes, and then you can basically be notified when the blob changes. This is again essential for something like point-in-time restore. As you can see, if you enable this, then it's forcing soft delete, tracking changes, and versioning to be enabled. So this blob feed will allow you to basically have an event that's fired when the storage account gets updated, and then be able to do actions based on that. We're going to leave, in my case for this example, everything turned off. So we're just going to now get to the creation screen. I won't add any metadata tags. I'll say review and create, validation passed, and I can just click the create button. And within a few minutes, it can be very fast, that storage account is available for me to store data in it, to store files, etc. So we'll let that run, and when we come back, we'll look into the storage account. So that storage account was created very quickly, and I'm into the storage account now. We can see the overview tab, and this has changed over the last recent months. We now have multiple tabs here to give us access to the most frequently requested features. Under Properties, which is the first tab, we can see all of the features that we set when we created the storage account, as well as links that will allow us to change the setting if we're allowed to change it after creation. So these are all the features of the storage account that we just created. Under the Monitoring tab, we can see the graphs. And so we can basically, we just created the storage account, but we can create the graphs and see how much data is leaving Azure, that's egress, how much data is coming into the storage account, that's ingress. The latency is the amount of milliseconds it takes to access a file, and the number of requests coming in. If we go in the Capabilities tab, this is where we can upgrade and enhance the usage of our storage account. Microsoft has a feature called Static Website, where you can store HTML, CSS, and JavaScript into your storage account and use it as a web server. So there's no dynamic content going on here, but you can store those static files and basically host it here. Data protection, we saw this in the setup in terms of basically enabling the how long files are soft delete for. Lifecycle management can move data from hot to cool to archive depending on the number of days that have passed. CDN is a way of accessing your static files more quickly, pushes them out into more points of presence around the world so that local clients can access local files instead of having to come to your storage account here, in this case, Canada. You can give your storage account a custom domain. So if the domain name that's been assigned to the storage account, which I'll show you in a second, is not something you want people to see, you can basically create a custom domain for that. Azure Defender is available to protect your files. It's like a it's like Windows Defender on your computer, but Azure Defender actually is an enhancement to the threats of your service. I accidentally clicked it here, so let's go back up to the storage account. And the private endpoints, we just saw how to create those. Now, Microsoft Azure Advisor, we just created the storage account, so there's not going to be any recommendations, but if there were storage-related recommendations, they would show up here. You can find more tutorials, quick starts, documentation, code under here, and if you want to download the client library so you can integrate your development environment with Azure Storage, those are available here. Now, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you, in terms of this storage account, that it basically, we have the ability to access it through what are called access keys. So when I click on this, actually, I'm going to go into, under access keys. This is my storage account name, and we basically have 2 access keys. Now, the reason they give you 2 is so that if you accidentally reveal one of them, then you're going to have to then regenerate it for security reasons, and then you should probably switch to the second one. It allows you to deploy a change of a key without having to break any of your existing applications. I'm going to go ahead and click the Show Keys button so we can see the this key. Now, if you had access to this key, you can get access to this storage account because it has a public endpoint. So keep this key as secure as possible. Don't share it with too many people. If you're using this in code somewhere, you can get the connection string here as well. We can see the storage account name. We can see the key already embedded into it here. Okay. Like I said, there's two keys. If, let's say in this case, key 1 accidentally got revealed, and so we switch all of our code to use key 2, and we click this regenerate button to regenerate key 1, and the key completely changes. The previous key no longer valid. The matching concept for access keys is called a shared access signature. It's abbreviated as SAS. This allows you to delegate access to other applications or individuals without revealing your key. And you can also limit access. So access keys give you full ownership access of the storage account. Well, with a shared access signature, I can say, well, I only want to allow access to the blob storage, an individual file, not the entire container, and I only want to give them read access to a particular file. And then I can set an expiry date. Let's say I want to give somebody 6 months access. I can basically filter by IP address if I want to be that specific. Now this storage account is HTTPS only, but if we didn't have it, we can enable HTTP access through SAS here, routing, and then we use our key to sign this connection string. So here is the SAS token that we can append to our URL. You can see the question mark means it's a query string. Append to our URL, and that will allow us to access a particular object within our storage account. We also have the full-on URL here, and we can talk about custom URLs another time in terms of changing this. So here we can see that access keys is the default way if you've enabled it to access your storage account, but it does give full access, and there's the only way to revoke it is to regenerate the key. Shared access signatures give you more fine-grained access, have things such as expiry dates, and a lot of limited permissions. And then when you create that, you can give this URL to somebody, and they'll have very specific access to a very specific object in your storage account for a limited time. If you were to regenerate the key, then this SAS does also become invalid. So if you ever need to revoke your shared access signature before the end date, you can basically regenerate your key. It's one way to do that. So shared access signatures are better for giving access to third parties than giving them your access key. Now we have this new storage account. We've seen that we can access it through access keys, but we don't have anything in it just as of yet. So I'm going to create a container for the first time, and I'm going to go under Settings, Data Storage, and Containers. I click on the New Container button, and I'm given a choice to create a name. So I'm going to create my container, and I'm going to call it Default, because I'm unoriginal and unimaginative. Now we can see here that we do have the ability to create a private account, which is the default. Or we can allow files in this storage account to be accessed from the external world without an access key, which is called anonymous access. And so I can create the whole container for anyone to be able to read from. Not write to, but read from. But you see this orange caution signal because that is a security risk of having a container that anyone can read from. So we'll leave this as a private access. Now if I click create, it'll create this default container. Now the container is there, but it doesn't contain anything. Right within the Azure Portal, we can upload files into this container, and it's going to go to my local machine here and be able to choose files to put into that. So if I click this folder icon, it's going to take me to the videos of this course actually. And so I can choose, let's create the storage account video, 50 megabytes. Again, I can say upload. And so it's taking this file from my computer, uploaded it into the container that we created called default, and that completed. So now we have a file in our storage account. Now remember, we said that the files are charged by gigabyte, and so this is only 50 megabytes, which is less than 1 gigabyte. We're still going to be charged for a full gigabyte. As of the last check, it is 1.8 cents per gigabyte per month. So I'm only going to be charged less than 2 cents per month to store this file and maybe another 20 files of similar size. So let's look at the file itself. Now you can see there's 3 dots at the end. And remember, we were just creating the shared access signature. We could create the shared access signature for this file and allow the public to access this from the public. So I'm going to demonstrate that security concept to you. I'm going to go into properties, and I can see that the URL is copyable. Now, if I go into my browser and I paste that URL, you'll see it says resource not found. So this video, we know it's a video, we just uploaded it, but we didn't provide the correct access key. So if I was to go and say create SAS, and I'm going to use the account key, give myself read permissions. It's a 1 day only, and I just want to say generate SAS. I can get that URL right here, copy. And now when I paste it, it has the shared access signature to the end, including a signed signature. It does not contain my actual key, but it's signed by the key. And I should be able to see the first video of this section, and that's a lovely pause of my face. So you can see here, we were able to access the file publicly because we created the shared access signature. So that's how we created a container, and we created a blob inside of that container. Now, even though we were able to upload a file using the inside of the container, this is not the preferred or recommended way to interact with a storage account. Now I'm going to go back up to the top level of the storage account here, even to the overview screen. Now, the recommended way to interact with a storage account is programmatically. And so you could use the Azure SDKs to integrate your applications into a storage account. You can use the REST APIs, or you can use a tool called Storage Explorer. Now, Storage Explorer has a software that you can download and install on your computer. And so if we say open in Explorer here, this will try to open this storage account in Storage Explorer, which is installed on your local machine, and you can download Storage Explorer if you do not have it. Now, there is a browser-based Storage Explorer, and I'm going to click on that here. So that is connecting to our storage account, and I'm going to minimize this. And we can see the container that I created, and we can see the file that I uploaded. We have the download, upload options. We can create folder systems. So if we want to say a child folder, then there's no files in there. We can navigate up to the higher tier, etc. So we do have all of these features with Storage Explorer. But even the Storage Explorer in the browser is not the recommended way. Again, we want to do it programmatically from your applications, or using Storage Explorer, which is software you can download onto your local. Now, you do have also access to the other aspects of a storage account. We haven't talked about it yet, but we said there was a file system within the storage account which had a hierarchical structure, not a container structure. Queues for messages, and tables, which is for data. Okay. So pretty much that's how you interact with a storage account. We saw that you can create containers, upload files using the portal, but you really should be looking at the programmatic ways, including Storage Explorer, but the SDKs, the APIs, the other ways that we can integrate with storage accounts in our applications. You'll remember when we created this storage account that I chose locally redundant storage as the replication model. What this means is, since I created this in Canada Central, that for every file I store in the storage account, there are 2 additional copies stored in Canada Central for 3 total copies. If there ever was a hardware failure, some type of disk that dies, and they do happen, then Microsoft Azure will automatically be able to put that hard disk aside and create a new copy of the file. It's invisible to me. There's a thing called durability, and Microsoft Azure has a very high level of durability. Once you give it a file and it accepts the file, it actually, they call it 11 nines of durability, where it's basically only one file in billions does it ever lose once it's accepted the file. So it does a very good job of keeping files, and once it's accepted, it'll never lose it. We can move to GeoRedundant Storage if we wanted to. We go under configuration. So scroll down here under settings, configuration, and we can see a lot of the settings, one of them being replication. And so after the fact, now that I've got this account going, I do want to move to GeoRedundant Storage. Notice that the zone-based storage is not an option after the fact. So once I set GeoRedundant Storage and click Save, Azure is now creating another version of the storage account in another region, and it's going to then make a copy of my files in that region. So now I have the same storage account in 2 regions for ultimate redundancy. So if there was ever a geographic disaster, if Canada Central had a power outage or the internet was down and flooding, then I've got my files in another region. So let's go under endpoints. And now we can see the URLs that Azure has assigned. As you can see, the blob service has its own unique URL, file service has a different one, etc. So this is going to be, I'm going to go back up to overview now. And we can see that it is migrated to GeoRedundant Storage, but I still only have that one method of accessing the files through that single endpoint. If I had changed this instead to do read access storage, then I would end up with 2 endpoints, one that is read and write and the other that is read only. I'm going to leave this as GeoRedundant Storage. Now we can go into GeoReplication here, and we can see that the secondary region is being set up. So Canada Central is my primary region, and now Canada East in Quebec is my secondary region, but the synchronization is still occurring. So I can't actually force a failover from my primary to my secondary until this synchronization has been complete. What I'm going to do is pause the video here, and then when we come back, we're going to force a failover, or go through that process of saying, you know what, let's move our files to Canada East permanently, and we can do that in a second. So let's talk about failover real quick. We give this a few minutes. It took almost an hour actually. Now we have the primary storage in Canada Central, the failover secondary storage in Canada East. And because this is not a read access globally redundant storage, I don't have access to this files in Canada East. It's just there in case of emergency. Well, let's say the emergency does happen and you can't get access to Canada Central for some reason. There is this failover button. So you can essentially start up this failover. You do have to go through this process of confirming that you do want to make the Canada East region your primary region. The Canada Central region will go away, and you'll be downgraded to locally redundant storage. And if you want to, you can go through that process again of converting it to GeoRedundant Storage and get your secondary recreated again in Canada Central. So once we do this failover, it's permanent. You can see what date and time was the last time the synchronization occurred. And if I say failover, then basically I've swapped, made this my primary, and I'd have to go ahead and create a new secondary. So this is a permanent action, but this is how you would do it manually. You can also, of course, create this programmatically. So if you can alert that Canada Central's down, you can set up this failover. But I'm not sure you necessarily want to do that automatically, because the consequences are potentially data losing. And, if it's a transient error where it goes away for a few minutes and then comes back, it might be better to deal with that than to have to fail over to a new URL and a new region. So this is something you'd probably want to do manually. Well, that's it. That's the end of our look at Azure Storage Accounts. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please give a thumbs up. It really helps with the YouTube algorithm. And if you're interested in more videos like this, check out my channel and hit the subscribe button to be notified when I have a new video. If you're interested in this course, I did put together a multi-hour course talking about Azure administration. The link is in the description of this video. So check that out if you're interested in getting certified, or at least learning all the skills required to manage an Azure Storage account. This has been Scott Duffy from GetCloudSkills.com. I hope you are having a wonderful day.